Growing up, I was told that life was easy to be an Australian. Although I am Australian, as a byproduct of two immigrant parents, I grew up with little to no resource in a country, culture, and environment which was so drastically different to the one I knew at home. Despite my perfect English, citizenship, and outwardly appearance, I never felt as though I was Australian. In fact, I felt as though I was too different, too Asian. I was not Australian when kids pulled back their eyes and called me derogatory names, only for everyone around me to dub it as a harmless joke. I was not Australian when harmful stereotypes were placed upon me to degrade my character. I was not Australian when my 3-letter last name was too complicated and too Asian for a whitewashed replacement, leading to years' worth of trauma from torment and name-calling. I was not Australian when my food was labelled to be too exotic and too Asian compared to the white bread and Vegemite sandwiches others had. I was not Australian when I was glared at, stared at, and spat at in public by strangers during a global pandemic, merely because I was Asian. It is hard to have to grow up in a country and culture which doesn't reflect nor celebrate whatever I see in the mirror. It is hard to have to grow up and constantly wonder, what is wrong with yourself? Only for your race to be weaponized against you. It is hard to have to relearn how to love a culture which you have spent years despising and ignoring. I didn't start loving both myself and my ethnicity on any random day. It was a years-long process which started with a simple 3-worded question. Who am I? It's a question little kids often ask their parents or teachers when telling a riddle. Yet somehow this question had led me to the beginnings to the riddle of myself and of my identity. You see, while asking myself this question, I had stumbled upon a bit of a problem. I was in a bit of a dilemma. No matter how many times I asked myself this question, I could never find the answer that was just right. The one that seemed to satisfy the question perfectly. The issue wasn't that there were just too few or seemingly incorrect answers. No, the problem was rather the opposite. There were just too many. There were tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, probably an infinite amount of all unique answers, which were all correct in their own way, but none of them were just right. None of them managed to capture who I was as a person perfectly. And so that was my dilemma. And when I sat back and I thought to myself, I started to think aloud and I said, why is this so hard to answer? The question isn't wordy, but why can't I just do it? And upon hours and hours of pondering, I had reached a conclusion. The question is hard to answer because to do so, you have to fully express yourself as a person, to wholly distinguish yourselves from others. Who am I? This question asks you to define your individual identity. Once I had finally understood what who am I was actually asking, I began to ask one more very crucial question. How am I supposed to know who I am? You see, the funny thing about individual identity is that it's contingent and temporary. It fluctuates, differing from one time to another, from one place to another. Our identities are subjected to what we consider to be important, and our attitudes towards each individual thing differs, whether that be minimally or that be drastically. To put this into perspective, I want you to cast your minds way back to when you were just 5. I know this may be hard, but just try. Think of yourself when you were 5. What did you think of yourself back then? Who and what were you? What did you like? What did you dislike? Now, once you've gotten a pretty clear image, I want you to think about who you are right now, in this moment as I'm talking to you. How would you define yourself now? Now, once you've gotten a pretty good idea of these two things, I just want you to compare them. What's similar? What's different? And the thing that's probably going through a lot of your minds is, geez, I was really different back then. And that's normal. Because you see, our individual identity changes. As we grow and as we learn and as we meet more people, our attitudes can vary. Our personal beliefs develop and change. That is our human nature. But just because my individual identity has changed since when I was 5, that doesn't mean it doesn't affect who I am. And what I'm basically trying to say is our past identities add and compile up to compose our present and future identities. Who I am in the past affects who I am now, and who I am now affects who I am in the future. So, to really understand who I was, I had to go back in time. I had to find out who I was and understand it. Understanding the past was easy. The hard part was finding out how it affected me. I came to find out that a small part of me had begun to reject the Vietnamese part of myself. That I had begun to wish I was white. I had begun to find shame in my own race, and I was disowning my culture. In my quest to fit into the world around me, I was erasing my people and my culture from my character. And when I found out about this, I was horrified. I couldn't understand how I could possibly do this to myself. And so I tried to see the world just a bit differently. I tried to see in between the cracks of everyday life. And I saw one thing that was apparent almost everywhere. The racism towards nearly every race in this country is so blatantly internalized. It is so oftenly ignored to the point where it's become neglected. Because so many people, when they do an offensive act, they sit back and they say, what did I do wrong? It's your fault for being offended. It's your fault for being too sensitive. It is your fault for being a snowflake. It is not my problem. And because of those words, so many people lose their way. So many people lose their way into answering the question of who am I? The Asian experience and identity in Western culture is one which has often been ignored and appropriated. And for years, the label has been defined by stories like my own. Or, in a political sense, the mobility of Asians who have immigrated overseas. Now, the thing about this label is it's not very accurate. It's just a geographic titular label which doesn't consider nor recognize the diversity and individualities of its millions of descriptors. It doesn't tell our stories, because the reality for many of us Asians and for many races is that if we are attacked, harassed, or discriminated against in public, we understand that the offenders almost certainly targeted us because of the color of our skin, or because we just didn't seem to fit in. The Asian identity is perhaps one of ostracism. In the sphere of racial politics, Asians inhabit a purgatorial status. And that's to say, we aren't white and we aren't black. We just exist in the in-between. And due to this, many of us exist as caricatures, as the working bees of the service industry, as the nerds in school who always top tests, as the kids who have to run home early because of our strict parents, as the math-crunching managers who keep businesses running, but who never seem to be able to get a promotion because our faces just don't suit leadership roles. And because of this, the Asian identity has a somewhat content problem. While I exist on the outside as impassive, calm, composed, and cool, I'm internally about to drown. I'm on the verge of breaking down into tears every single day because I live knowing that I will never be enough. I am constantly overcompensating to relinquish my feelings of inadequacy Because no matter how hard I try, no matter how hard I work, no matter how many hours I have spent on something, it will never be enough for this world because I am a woman of colour. Now, I'm going to take you back to this conversation about racial politics. Because many Asians inhabit the in-between, we begin to be labelled as this model person of colour, as a weapon to use against other races, but also as a scapegoat to ease racial tensions as the honorary white person. The funny thing about this, though, is that we aren't ever given the full perquisites of true whiteness. We're never going to be regarded as truly equal. And in an era and in a time defined by personal opinion, by likes, dislikes, love, hatred, and resentment, many Asians understand the resentment and frustrations of both sides of this racial spectrum. We have felt the resentment of the white besieged and demanded for reparation, but we also have tasted of the frustrations of the thwarted and rejected social justice warrior. We have felt both sides, but sometimes we're denied the entitlements of either. And this births this sense of racial self-hatred. Racial self-hatred, by its definition, is to see yourself from the white lens, to become your own worst enemy. And one of the defenses against this kind of hatred is to become critical and hard on yourself, to essentially destroy your own character. And I am sure many of you sitting here have heard stories about how Asians and many other people of colour have said that they tried to whitewash themselves, that they begun to mock their food, that they mocked an accent, that they made a joke about their parents, that they made a joke about their culture. And it's hard, because when you're doing this, you begin to distance yourself from your background, distance yourself from your family, and you become a stranger to becoming who you are. You try so hard to fit into being this white mold, but we're never going to be white, because that's not who we are. The Asian identity, thus, is perhaps one of silence, to live as a servile figure who doesn't interfere with racial matters. But for the Asian self to be fully realised, for us to finally be able to answer the question of who am I, we need to live without constraints, to live without the need to reject our culture and our heritage. My dream, as well as the dream of almost every single person of colour, is to live without judgment. I will be Australian the day when I get to live without the mockery of my features, culture, and heritage. I will be Australian the day when I get to stand up for myself, when I get to protest, and when I am heard. I will be Australian when my culture is celebrated with appreciation and not appropriation. And when offence is taken, I want for there to be respect, camaraderie, and accountability to be taken. I want for everyone, for every community, for this multicultural nation of Australia, for every single person across the globe to unite against this one issue of racism. I want to be more than a stereotype, to be more than a caricature, and I want for the world to accept the minute differences between each person. And my greatest achievement in my life till this day is finally being able to answer the question of who am I? To finally accept my culture, to finally find home and comfort in my background. And one of my only dreams left in life is for others to feel this as well. Our experiences and our hopes can ultimately be summarized by this one quote from Michelle Zorner's Crying in H Mart. We're all searching for a piece of home or a piece of ourselves.